You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk.
Did you know the EU and the US are merging corporate trade law legally, or at least trying to, and that will be shutting out China and Russia in trade? It's called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, but that's a bit of a mouthful, so it's been shortened by the campaigners around it to TTIP, and it looks like it could be brought in at the end of this year. And I'm joined on the line now by Linda Korscher from Stop TTIP. Hi, Linda, and welcome to Dialect.
Hi.
Can you just tell us whereabouts does this come from, this TTIP, and what is it?
Well, the EU negotiates trade agreements on our behalf, and it's this trade agreement, like all the EU's trade agreements, very much driven by transnational corporations, and particularly financial service corporations.
Okay, so we like to think of the EU, at least, of being quite democratic with the European Parliament, MEPs and that kind of thing. So have they drawn this up, or is somebody else drawn it up, this agreement?
Well, the agreement's being negotiated. This is the process. The negotiations go on for as long as they take, really. It's certainly been an idea to bring together the market of the EU and the US for quite a long time. It took a bit of a dip when the liberalization of financial services caused the global financial crisis, but it's been spun now into the answer to economic recovery.
Well, of course. If trade is made easier between the EU and the US, you would have thought that the economy might take off.
Yeah, but this is not about trade. But it's handy to call it trade because the general picture is that if it's trade, it must be good.
Hang on, because it says actually trade in the title, doesn't it? Transatlantic
Trade.
Trade.
It's called a trade agreement for that reason, because it carries that sort of vibe that it's trade, it must be good. But the focus, in discussing this, the focus is always on the fact that tariffs will come down and that will make consumer prices cheaper. But in actual fact, the tariffs between the EU and the US are already very low, so there's not a lot in it for tariffs. But this is really it's a corporate rights charter. This actually gives rights to corporations and correspondingly reduces the ability of governments to control corporations.
Okay, but let's try and get to the origins of it. So has it actually been drawn up by MEPs, by European Commission? Who's actually drawn this up? Because it's probably going to be in their interests, I'd imagine.
The EU is three structures. The European Parliament that we vote for, the Council is made up of the member state representatives of the member state governments, and then the Commission, which is unelected bureaucracy and very much driven by the tremendous corporate lobbying in Brussels. So for an agreement like this, the Commission writes its own mandate, gets it past the Council and the European Parliament, and then goes ahead and secretly negotiates for, as I say, as long as it takes to negotiate the agreement. And then finally, when that's completed, it comes back before the European Parliament, which only has the power of assent. They can only say yes or no at that point, no amendments. And because this agreement will be what's called a mixed agreement there, that means that the member state parliaments have a bit of say in it as well. It will also come back to member state parliaments after it's gone through the European Parliament. If they say yes to it, then it will come back to member state parliaments for ratification. But don't wait for that one with the UK, because it will just come back to the UK as secondary legislation, as a rubber stamping exercise.
I've heard that it's supposed to be all signed and sealed by the end of this year. Is that right?
That was their original intention. It was launched in the summer of last year, the summer of 2013, and it was supposed to be done on one tank of gas. It was said, basically get it through quickly before anyone realises what it involves, before people realise what's happening. But it's not going that fast, and as I say, a trade agreement takes as long as it takes, and one thing that gets in the way is elections, because nobody wants to talk about trade agreements, strangely, when there are any elections around. So there's been there have been 6 rounds of negotiations, which doesn't mean anything really. It tells you there's been 6 rounds, but you don't know how many there will be. So, towards the end of this year, there are midterm elections in the US, so that will put a brake on it there. And then negotiations at the start of next year for a while. But then towards the end of next year, the US will be heading into their long process of presidential elections in the run-up to that. So that's something else that would be in the way of negotiations continuing. So it could or couldn't be signed up in, say, the first half of next year.
Okay,
That's
I know.
Sort of timeline.
One of the sorts of organisations in Britain that's been campaigning on this is the trade unions. Why are the trade unions interested?
Well, there are big implications for jobs, loss of jobs. Trade unions are also concerned about public services, and particularly concerned, and there's very wide concern about the provision in this agreement for corporations to be able to sue governments for any regulatory change that negatively affects their future profits.
But can't they already do that? Corporations can sue the government if they want to?
No, not really, no. This provision exists in trade agreements in other parts of the world, so we can see the effects that it has. So it's like some examples are the Australian government being sued for its public health legislation with plain packaging for cigarettes, being sued by Philip Morris. The German government is being sued by a Swedish nuclear power company called Vattenfall for phasing out nuclear power. And the Egyptian government has been sued by Veolia, the water supply company, for increasing its minimum wage. So you can see that it can lead to big payouts. It can lead to a chilling effect on government's legislative process as they become afraid to legislate, really, on the stuff that we need them to legislate on the environmental stuff, on the labour rights, on public health. Because these are the very things that will negatively affect transnational corporations' future profits.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of big corporations are looking at the British healthcare industry and saying, well, actually, as the NHS is opened up to competition and privatised, there are a lot of big private healthcare companies looking at that as a way of making money. So would TTIP, if it's signed, affect what happens to the National Health Service?
The NHS. Yeah, in fact, the widespread concern about the NHS has really served to raise the issue of a trade agreement, because this TTIP, because trade agreements are usually pretty obscure stuff that no one's interested in, but people have find it not difficult to understand that we're stuck with the Health and Social Care Act and all the disasters that's taken us into. But the difference that TTIP will make is that the act becomes irreversible. It's not hard to understand why that's a disastrous thing for us.
Well, I mean, it means Labour Party policy is null and void, doesn't it? Because they're supposed to be, well, they're saying that if they win the next general election in 2015, that they will actually repeal the act.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, that's right, null and void, yeah.
I find it a bit strange that any company or whatever could sue a government just for passing a law, because actually that's what governments are there to do, surely on our behalf.
Yes, it's and it's only transnational companies that can do it, like cross-border. So it's discriminatory in that way that a domestic company couldn't do it. But also, these cases are heard before an arbitration panel of 3 trade lawyers. So right outside of our legal systems and over the top of our legal systems, really. So 3 trade lawyers who might be the arbitrators on that case, and then another time they will be acting for corporations in other cases, or they might be acting for the governments in other cases. It's a very small group of lawyers passing this work around, and obviously it's in their interest to keep it all going, and it's very highly paid work, yeah. But it means that it's a quasi-legal system outside of, and in fact above, our established national legal systems.
So are governments empowered to actually make agreements that make kind of null and void our own legal system? It just sounds a little bit like pie in the sky. I don't know if they'll be able to get away with it, Linda.
Well, it's in the mandate. It's in the Commission's mandate, and in fact, this aspect is called investor-state dispute settlement. So it's ISDS for short. So this is the provision for corporations to sue governments. The concern about it was so high that the Commission ran a 3-month consultation on this. It closed in mid-July, and more responses were received from this than from anything else previously. So 150,000 responses, and 50,000 of those, 1/3 of those, came from the UK.
Oh, well, it's nice to know that. The thing is, with these trade agreements, as you said before, Linda, it's seen by many people, probably the majority of us, as something which is way above our heads and is probably never going to affect us at all. Can you just give us an idea of how it might actually affect and impact our lives if this is signed? Right,
so a main part of this trade agreement is this suing the public purse in this, so the legislators will be inclined not to legislate. But a really major part of this trade agreement is harmonising the regulations between the EU and the US. That harmonising, supposedly for efficiencies, will actually be a deregulation. It will be a lowering of regulations to suit corporations.
So this is kind of going to the lowest common denominator. I mean, this happens, in so many areas of our lives now in this, increasingly globalised world. But what evidence have you got that it will, if you want, round down to the lowest rather than up to the highest? In other words, so that the regulations in the United States might have to be increased and tightened to bring it up to the standards of the EU.
Well, it's a corporate-driven agenda. The drivers are not there to bring regulation up. Everything's about taking it down. I'll give you an example with chemicals, and I mean chemicals run through everything, food and cosmetics. The US bans about 8 chemicals, and we ban 1,300. So we really have a lot to lose in this, and then you look at the food people eat in the US, like 70% of their supermarket food is genetically modified, whereas very, very little of our actual food is, although it is in some animal feed. Those companies are pretty determined that they're going to get GM into the EU. So we have a lot to lose in harmonising of regulation.
It sounds like the implications, Linda, of TTIP are absolutely colossal, enormous.
It goes across everything.
So why has there been so little about this in the London media?
Certainly the government doesn't want it talked about. In fact, none of the major parties want it talked about.
Why is that? I mean, you'd have thought that this is something that they could even win them votes, maybe.
Well, it will only be an election. Presently, all the major parties support it.
Really?
Yes, really.
They support deregulation, all the major parties in Britain?
Support TTIP, yeah.
Amazing, okay. Well, that may
be one
reason.
So it will only become an election issue if we make it an election issue.
And is there any prospect of that, do you think?
That's up to us to do it. I mean, none of this stuff is like a preset path. It's trade agreements have been defeated before, and usually a major factor is shining light on them, because when people know about them, they tend to think they're a bad deal. So spreading information, what we're doing now, in fact, is a really important part of it.
So tell us a bit about Stop TTIP. How do you operate, and are there ways that people can actually campaign on this issue if they want to, maybe even just online or writing letters to MPs?
We certainly need to raise it with MPs who it's easier for them to ignore it because they don't have much of a role in stuff that's done by the EU. But so once again, there's really a role for people to raise it with their MPs.
So is it make sense to actually even contact MEPs for a change? Because I don't think many people actually ever talk to their MEP, do they?
No, there's the democratic deficit, isn't it? Most people don't even know who they are, and certainly don't know how they vote. Yes, people getting in touch with it, because it will be the MEPs who will vote yes or no on this at some stage.
So tell us, what's Stop TTIP been doing?
We've put on public meetings highlighting different areas that will be affected. So we've had public meetings on NHS TTIP and food TTIP and environment and fracking TTIP. And we're going a bit further on October the 25th. We're putting on a meeting digging into how the City of London dominates policy making in this country and beyond.
Okay, well, I didn't know that. I thought that the policy was made by political parties, by the government, and also over in the EU and Brussels by the European Commission. So what role does the city play?
Financial services are a really big push here. For instance, the City UK, which is the front group for the transnational financial services that are the City of London, have had a committee for years called the Liberalization of Trade in Services Committee, and so that's the top guys from the top banks and other financial institutions actually giving the trade bureaucrats who take UK trade policy into the EU, our input into the EU. So they just give them their orders. So that bypasses the Parliament. Well,
that's
the public.
A bit annoying, isn't it? Because of course these banks have been given loads of cash. I think
it's
700.
The same old banks. That's right, the same old banks.
Well, the 750 billion or something they were bailed out in 2008, and they've been using that cash to lobby for even more deregulation. What else has Stop TTIP been doing?
Well, I've been going around speaking at a lot of meetings. Wherever people want to put meetings on, we're happy to go and speak to inform people about this.
So
this information side is a really key part of it.
So who's been interested, apart from the unions?
Oh, there's very broad interest now. Certainly when on the big demonstrations that I've been to recently, I mean, we've been handing out leaflets, but I've found the awareness is already there with people. So the big demonstrations on the climate change and the Jarrow March, for instance, in London, it was really heartening to realise how many people had some degree of grasp about TTIP already and want to know more. So people are recognising that it's a big deal and not finding it inaccessible. They realise they can grasp it and understand what it is, because the bottom line is not that complicated. It's a corporate takeover.
Our votes, if this goes through, are going to mean almost nothing, because anything that politicians try to do, they're going to find impossible financially, because they're going to be sued by big corporations.
Yeah, and you can see the sort of governments we get would be quite happy with that, really, to have that limitation on what they can do, yeah.
Ultimately, it sounds like a bit of a battle between a democratically elected system, parliaments and democracies, and big corporations. Who's going to win, ultimately?
That depends on us. It depends if we let them win. This is not, as I say, it's not pre-laid out path. It's how much we fight it.
And what kind of world do you think we'll get if this does go through? Because it seems to me that if you've got a legal jurisdiction which spreads right across the EU and the US, then that's a large part of the world's trade is controlled by a few corporations in those regions of the world.
Yeah, there's also a Trans-Pacific partnership being negotiated of 12 countries around the Pacific. The US is in both. So because this stuff's secret, we don't see what's in it, but there are enough leaks to see what's in it and to see that's heading in the same direction. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is the same sort of stuff as is in the TTIP, the Transatlantic one. So it's bigger than if both these agreements go through. The idea is that the corporations are not getting what they wanted from the WTO, the World Trade Organization, because within the structure of that, developing countries were able to team up and resist the corporate-driven agenda of Western countries. So the Doha round ground to a halt, and we shifted to these bilateral trade agreements. Now we're into the really big bilateral trade agreement, the two biggest economies, the EU and the US, and the Pacific ones going on at the same time. So if that were all to go through, they would set that through those agreements, global rules would be set, and the other countries drawn in separately and unable to team up to resist that agenda. So it would be imposing, this is a stated aim for TTIP, is to establish global rules in this way.
It sounds almost like these big corporations making the laws for the whole world. But anyway, how have these rounds of talks, you talked about, was it 6 or 8 rounds of talks, how have they been going? What do we know about what's been agreed so far? Things are not agreed yet. I mean, apart from the growing public resistance, there are a lot of differences within the negotiations as well. So some parts are kind of more advanced than others, and some parts are held up. I mean, can we use things like freedom of information laws to find out exactly what's being planned? Because one of the problems is that with many of these big corporate trade agreements is it can be sometimes quite difficult to find out what's being agreed in our name as the talks progress.
Oh, it is secret. It is secret. No, there is no freedom of information. It is secret. That was one key thing in the shift from the WTO, where you had these big global protests. The shift is not just from multilateral, like all the countries, shifting to bilateral, 2 countries. Another part of that shift was it all became much more secret. And the negotiations and the texts that they're using are secret until it's completed, even though it's being negotiated on our behalf. And it's secret from our members of parliament, our representatives there, and it's secret from the MEPs as well.
So who's actually making these negotiations, doing these negotiations on our behalf then?
The bureaucrats of the Trade Commission part of the whole Commission. So, like I said, it's in three parts: the Parliament, the Council, which is the representatives of governments, and then the unelected bureaucrats of the Commission. The Commission is in, I think, about 28 sections, so that every country gets to have a commissioner. But the heavyweight commission within that is the Trade Commission, and that's who does the negotiating on our behalf.
It doesn't sound like there's a lot of chance that these people are going to be acting for ordinary people across the EU. It sounds much more like they're just going to be doing exactly what big corporations want, and they haven't really got a very good track record of looking after public interest.
No, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite, yeah.
Have you learned anything in previous campaigns to do with trade that has, you think, maybe helped in campaigning this time, has taught you about the way that these big trade negotiations operate? It's good having the background. One thing I think it helps me see through the spin, because the spin on this, as I said, is like this trade agreement is the way for economic recovery from the financial crisis. But when you've been looking at this stuff for quite a few years, you see that in after 9/11,
it was actually the answer. The Doha round was the answer to global terrorism, and another time the trade agreements were the answer to climate change. So you can really sort of see the spin coming through.
Now, one of the effects has been, obviously, through your campaigning and Stop TTIP's campaigning, that the Labour Party is saying that it will defend the NHS from the EU-US trade deal. That happened earlier this year. Do you think that was a bit of a victory, and do you think they really mean it?
I think it's a victory that they're being forced to talk about it, but there's a lot of bluff going on. What we need is an exemption. No two ways about it. We need an exemption of the NHS from the trade agreement, or better still, an exemption of health, because an exemption of the NHS would still be vulnerable, unlike alcohol legislation or cigarette legislation or something with the suing mechanism, right? But with the Labour Party, you're hearing it from who? Andy Burnham, who is currently the shadow health person, but might not be if they got into government. He could be moved quite easily. And you're hearing it from John Healey, who actually chairs the all-party parliamentary group in the Parliament, which is backed by big business and promotes TTIP. So not a lot of credibility there. Who you're not hearing it from is Miliband. To have a chance of pushing Cameron towards seeking an exemption from the NHS, we'd need Miliband on the floor of the House calling for this. You're not hearing it from Miliband. So that would have two effects. It would raise it to the level of the opposition totally supporting an exemption and calling on the government to do that, but it would also put a public focus on it and force journalists even to pay some attention to it. And spread public awareness at the same time. So that's what we need for an exemption. But we're not getting that. We're just getting one or two people in the Labour Party calling for that, and one of them's pretty dodgy. At least one of them's pretty dodgy anyway.
I noticed just this week that the European Union's Trade Commissioner-elect, that's because they're just about to bring in a new commission, Malmstrom, has been clarifying that public services are in some ways going to be exempt from the trade negotiations. So do you think that's another little victory there?
No, no, I think it's all bluff. I mean, you're dealing with a very complex legal situation of our Health and Social Care Act and how that opens up to private contracting. You're dealing with EU competition law laid over the top of that, and then you're dealing with a trade agreement over the top of that. So there's a lot of legal complexity there, and there's a lot of room for them to dance around and pretend that this is safe, this is protected. But if it was true, they would just say it's exempt. We need the exemption, and all the rest, I think, is just bluff.
Well, the woman's name is Cecilia Malmstrom. She's going to be the new Commissioner for Trade for the EU. What they're saying is that she dealt quite impressively with a deluge of questions about this free trade agreement at her European Parliament hearing on 29th of September, acknowledging widespread scepticism but voicing hope that a resolution could be found. So there does seem some hope, even though you're saying actually you think that this is really kind of spin.
It was a very slick performance, and she made her way around the questions in a very slick manner.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it?
And then she was voted in, yeah. But then you've got to consider where most MEPs are at. The biggest grouping is the party that our Tories belong to. Another grouping is one that our Lib Dems belong to. Another grouping is the one that our Labour Party belongs to. I mean, that grouping's got doubts about ISDS and that, but I mean the Labour Party is essentially supporting TTIP. So There's no point in having the impression or the idea that all the MEPs are like really good guys, really there for us or anything like that. Only if we make them.
Yeah, Cecilia Malmstrom. I mean, call me a cynic if you want, but it sounds to me as if part of her test as to whether she's going to become the new European Trade Commissioner, and it now seems that she is whether she can spin, the TTIP as something wonderful. And it almost seems to me like these people aren't really our representatives on the Commission, that they're kind of almost PR people for the big corporations.
They're supposed to work for us. They're not representatives in the sense of being elected. They're bureaucrats. They are supposed to work for us, but the context of Brussels is very much suits and business. Yeah.
Also, China and Russia, we haven't mentioned them yet, because if this agreement is sealed between the Pacific people you were talking about, the EU, the US, where does the Chinese and the Russians stand in all this? Because it could end up with a sort of the world almost divided in half with a sort of giant trade war. Are they included in this, the Chinese and the Russians?
No, the Pacific Partnership particularly excludes China, that's right, yeah.
Interesting. Anyway, we'll see how this all plays out.
I think for Russia, the big deal at the moment is the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement that was the cause of everything that's happened in Ukraine and got signed up about a month ago.
Can you just explain that? I mean, I didn't realise this was related to Ukraine.
Yeah, there's been a Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, that's their words, not my description, lined up for a few years with Ukraine and also 5 other countries in the region. 3 of them have dropped right out of that now, so it's Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova that are still either signed up or heading towards that. And it was when the president pulled out of it at the last minute in February.
That's Yanukovych, the previous president, who was more pro-Russian.
Yes, and that's when effectively the civil war kicked off, and then top EU people were there trying to keep the Ukraine on side, and then they elected this chunky government and finally got their agreement signed up, and he resigned. That president resigned straight after, but they got their agreement signed, so that's been signed up now. I was in a meeting about 3 years ago in Warsaw actually, where it was admitted by the Trade Commission that there is no appetite for further expansion of the EU for more accessions, right, especially of low socioeconomic countries. So having deep and comprehensive free trade agreements is a substitute for accessions, and it's on a promise of that you join the EU eventually. So if you do it as a comprehensive as a trade agreement instead of an accession gets discussed amongst the whole EU, but a trade agreement is only dealt with by the Secretive Trade Commission. Interesting,
a kind of Trojan horse. Anyway, Linda, finally, where is a good place to follow developments with this TTIP?
StopTTIP.net website. We've got an email list that people can join for information.
That was Linda Korscher from the Stop TTIP campaign, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. That sounds absolutely massive, even though we've heard very, very little about it. Means big corporations could be taking over not just here in the EU, but in the US and in the Pacific too. Absolutely amazing. So let's have a little bit more coverage, I think, from other parts of the press, please. And her website is stopttip.net. That's stopttip.net. And you can get hold of a leaflet for the princely sum of £1.50, all about TTIP, bang up to date as well. Stopttip.net. Thanks very much to Linda Korscher. That's all for this week. Dialect is Bristol's first weekly MP3 podcast and is on Bristol Community FM 93.2 at 11am every Monday morning. If you're online, you could subscribe to our emails or download the podcast from dialectradio.oneword.co.uk. Thanks to our guests this week, John Scott from Beer Quarry Caves down there near Lyme Regis, and also Linda Corsher from Stop TTIP. Dialects of Bristol Broadband Co-op production, and anyone can contribute. If you'd like to, contact us through Volunteering Bristol on 0117 989 7733 or at bristolvolunteers.org.uk. That was Dialect, and I'm Tony Gosling, wishing you a very good week. Thanks for listening. Until the same time next week, goodbye for now.